Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
My name is Anna Fischer, and I suppose I should tell you that I never meant to become the kind of woman who searches through her husband's pockets. But then again, none of us in East Germany ever meant to become the people we became. It was Tuesday, November 18th, 1975, and the first snow had begun to fall on our quiet street in East Berlin. I remember the date precisely because it was the day I found my own file hidden in Klaus's winter coat. And some dates burn themselves into your memory like cigarette brands on wood. The morning had started like any other. Klaus left for his work at the ministry. He never specified which department, and I had learned not to ask. After 15 years of marriage, you develop a rhythm around such silences. He kissed my cheek at exactly 7:23, as he always did, tasting of the bitter coffee we could afford and the cologne that came in small bottles from the state store. "I'll be late tonight," he said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "Meeting with Comrade Richter." I nodded, watching him check his appearance one final time. Klaus was still handsome at 43, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested importance without ostentation. His hair was combed precisely, his shoes polished to a military shine, his coat brushed clean of lint. Everything about him spoke of order, of belonging to the machinery that kept our republic running smoothly. Our children, Greta and Hans, aged 13 and 11, barely looked up from their breakfast of dark bread and jam. They had inherited their father's ability to navigate around uncomfortable truths, though at their age it seemed more like instinct than learned behaviour. "Mama, Herr Schultz wants to speak with you after school," Greta said, not meeting my eyes. Herr Schultz was her teacher, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had been asking too many questions about our family lately. "What about, Liebling?" "Just about my essay on the agricultural reforms." She stirred her jam into small, nervous spirals. "He said it showed good socialist awareness." I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever the outside world pressed too close to our kitchen table. "That's wonderful, Greta. Your father will be proud." Klaus glanced at us over his newspaper, Neues Deutschland, naturally, but said nothing. The silence stretched like a held breath until he folded the paper with military precision and stood to leave. After the door closed behind him, I began the familiar choreography of our morning routine. Dishes washed and dried, children sent off to school with their satchels and the usual warnings about walking straight home. Then, finally, blessed quiet. I worked at the local library, a position that suited my nature, and provided what Klaus called appropriate intellectual stimulation for a woman of my education. The library was a refuge of sorts, though even there, certain books lived in locked cabinets, and certain questions were never asked aloud. That morning, as I was preparing to leave for work, I noticed Klaus had forgotten his leather gloves. November was turning cruel, and his hands would suffer for it. I decided to take them to him at lunch, a small act of widely devotion that would cost me nothing and might earn me one of his rare, genuine smiles. I reached into his coat pocket, the heavy wool one he wore to important meetings, and felt the familiar texture of his gloves. But my fingers found something else as well. A manila folder, thin but substantial, tucked deep into the inner pocket. I should have stopped there, should have simply taken the gloves and gone about my day, but the folder was slightly warm from his body heat, and something about its weight made my hands tremble. Inside, I found my own face staring back at me from a black and white photograph I didn't remember posing for. Below it, my name: Anna Elizabeth Fischer, née Brenner. Born March 12, 1934, Leipzig. Current address: Friedrichstrasse 47, East Berlin. Occupation: librarian, Public Library, District 5. Marital status: married to Klaus Fischer, Ministry for State Security, Department 8. Ministry for State Security, Department 8. The Stasi. My husband worked for the Stasi, and he had been keeping a file on me. Had those small recording devices in the radio programs been right? Were we all being watched, all the time, even by those who shared our beds? The file was thin, perhaps 20 pages, but each sheet felt heavy as lead in my hands. There were photographs: me walking to work, me at the library, me speaking with Frau Weber from next door. Someone had been following me, documenting my movements, my conversations, my expressions, when I thought I was alone. But more disturbing were the reports written in Klaus's familiar handwriting, his careful script, the same hand that wrote birthday cards for our children and grocery lists for our household, now detailed my subversive tendencies and questionable associations. Subject displays inappropriate interest in Western literature. Observed reading passages from Kafka during lunch break. Recommend continued observation. Subject's conversation with neighbour Heinrich Müller on November 3rd included criticism of bread rationing. Müller's file updated accordingly. Subject demonstrates concerning attachment to pre-socialist cultural values. Listens to jazz recordings when children are at youth group meetings. Jazz recordings. He knew about my secret jazz collection, the records my father had hidden during the war and that I had kept hidden since. The music that transported me to places where people moved differently, thought differently, loved differently. I closed the file with shaking hands and returned it to his coat pocket, arranging the gloves exactly as I had found them. Then I sat on our small sofa, the one we had bought together during our first year of marriage, when we still talked about our dreams, and tried to understand what my life had become. The apartment felt different now, charged with new meaning. Was the telephone listening to us? Were our neighbours reporting our dinner conversations? Had our entire marriage been a kind of professional assignment for Klaus? I thought about our wedding day in 1960, how proud he had looked in his new suit, how he had whispered promises about our future together. I thought about the night Greta was born, how he had held my hand and cried when the doctor placed our daughter in his arms. I thought about 1,000 small intimacies, tiny moments of connection that had built our life together. Had any of it been real? When lunchtime came, I did not take Klaus his gloves. Instead, I sat in the library's back room, surrounded by books that had been approved for public consumption, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Frau Richter, my supervisor, found me there an hour later, staring at an open book without reading it. "Anna, are you unwell?" You look quite pale." I looked up at her kind face. Frau Richter had always been gentle with me, had sometimes bent the rules to let me access books from the restricted collection for research purposes. Now I wondered, was she reporting these small kindnesses? Was everyone I trusted contributing to some larger portrait of my political reliability? "I'm fine," I managed. "Just tired." She nodded sympathetically. "These November days, they drain the soul, don't they? Go home early if you need to. The evening shift can manage." I thanked her and returned to work, but I spent the rest of the day seeing everything through new eyes. The patrons who came to check out books, were some of them watching me? The man who had been coming in regularly to read newspapers, was he documenting which sections I read during my breaks? When I walked home that evening, I found myself looking over my shoulder, noting which windows had lights behind their curtains, wondering who might be watching from behind those curtains. The city that had been my home for 15 years suddenly felt like a stage set. Every interaction potentially scripted, every conversation potentially recorded. Klaus was already home when I arrived, sitting at our kitchen table with papers spread before him. Official documents with state seals, forms requiring his signature. He looked up when I entered, and for the first time in years, I really studied his face. "You forgot your gloves this morning," I said, hanging my coat on its hook. "Yes, I noticed." My hands were quite cold. He signed another document with a flourish. "How was your day at the library?" "Quiet. Frau Richter was asking about you." "Oh? What did she want to know?" I had invented this detail, a small test. "She wondered what department you worked in." I told her I wasn't sure. Klaus's pen paused for just a moment, so brief I might have imagined it, before continuing its path across the page. "That's correct. The work is quite routine. Nothing that would interest her." "Of course." But I had seen that pause, that tiny break in his performance. Now I was watching him the way he had been watching me, and I was beginning to understand that in East Germany, everyone was both observer and observed, hunter and prey. That night at dinner, I listened to my family with new ears. Every conversation felt layered, every innocent comment potentially dangerous. Hans told us about his friend Peter, whose father had been transferred to a new job in Dresden. "Peter says they had to move very quickly," Hans said, cutting his schnitzel into precise squares. "Just 3 days' notice." Klaus looked up from his plate. "Transfers happen when they're needed for the good of the state." But Peter was crying. He didn't want to leave his friends. "Children adjust," Klaus said firmly. "They're more adaptable than adults." Greta, who had been quiet all evening, suddenly spoke. "Herr Schultz says some families aren't committed enough to socialist principles. That's why they have to be relocated." The word hung in the air like smoke. Relocated. We all understood what it meant, even the children. "Herr Schultz is a very wise teacher," Klaus said, and I heard something new in his voice, a professional tone that hadn't been there before, or perhaps I simply hadn't recognised it. After dinner, as I washed dishes and Klaus helped the children with homework, I found myself studying the ordinary moments of our domestic life. Klaus checking Greta's mathematics, his patient explanations and gentle corrections. Hans showing his father a drawing he had made of a factory worker. Klaus's genuine smile, his arm around his son's shoulders. These moments felt real. They had to be real. But later, after the children were in bed, Klaus and I sat in our small living room as we did every evening. He read his reports while I mended clothes or read approved literature. Tonight, I watched him over the edge of my book, a novel about a factory worker who finds love through dedicated service to the state. "Anna," Klaus said suddenly, not looking up from his papers, "have you been feeling well lately?" My heart began to race. "What do you mean? You seem distant." Now he did look up, and his eyes held something I couldn't identify. Concern? Suspicion? "Is there anything troubling you?" I thought about the file in his coat pocket, about my photographed face and his careful handwriting documenting my subversive tendencies. I thought about 15 years of marriage, about our children sleeping in the next room, about the delicate architecture of our shared life. "I'm fine, Klaus." He nodded and returned to his papers, but I felt his attention lingering on me like heat from a dying fire. That night, lying beside him in our narrow bed, I listened to his breathing shift into the rhythm of sleep. In the darkness, Klaus looked younger, more vulnerable. His face was peaceful, free of the careful control he maintained during waking hours. I studied the familiar landscape of his features, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the lines that had deepened around his eyes over the years we had been together. This was the man who had held me during thunderstorms, who had stayed awake all night when Hans had pneumonia, who had cried with me when I miscarried our third child. This was the man who knew exactly how I liked my coffee, who brought me small gifts from his business trips, who still reached for my hand sometimes when we walked together. This was also the man who had documented my subversive tendencies and photographed me without my knowledge. I rose carefully, not wanting to wake him, and moved to the window. Our street was quiet, lit by a few dim street lamps that cast long shadows between the identical apartment buildings. Somewhere out there, in similar apartments, other couples were sleeping in similar beds. How many of them were keeping secrets from each other? How many were watching and being watched by the people they loved most? From our window, I could see into the apartment across the street, where Herr and Frau Zimmermann lived with their teenage daughter. Their lights were still on, and I could see them moving around their kitchen, cleaning up after their evening meal. They looked so ordinary, so innocent. Were they reporting on their neighbours? Were their neighbours reporting on them? I thought about Heinrich Müller, our neighbour, whose criticism of bread rationing Klaus had noted in my file. Heinrich was a kind man who sometimes helped me carry groceries up the stairs. His wife had been dead for 2 years, and he often seemed lonely. Had I destroyed his life by engaging in his innocent complaints? Was he now being watched more closely because of what I had said? The weight of it all, the surveillance, the suspicion, the terrible possibility that everyone I knew was both victim and participant in this system, pressed down on me like water. I leaned my forehead against the cold window glass and tried not to cry. Behind me, Klaus stirred in his sleep, muttering something unintelligible. I turned to look at him, this stranger who was my husband, and realised that I was going to have to learn an entirely new way of living. I was going to have to become someone who could smile and cook dinner and make love, while knowing that every word, every gesture, every expression was potentially being catalogued and filed away. I was going to have to become someone like him. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of doubled existence. On the surface, our life continued exactly as before. Klaus left for work each morning at the same time, returned each evening with the same reports to review. The children attended school, completed their homework, participated in their youth group activities. I worked at the library, prepared meals, maintained our household with the same methodical care I had always employed. But underneath this familiar routine, I was learning to perform a more complex dance. I began to watch Klaus with the same attention he had been paying to me, noting his habits, his patterns, his small tells and inconsistencies. I discovered that he made mysterious phone calls every Tuesday evening while I was helping the children with their baths. He would speak quietly, using phrases like, "The subject shows no change," and "recommend continued observation." I learned to run the bathwater loudly, to give the children extra time to play in the tub, so I could listen to these conversations. I found that he received mail addressed to names that weren't his, letters that he would read quickly and then burn in our small stove. The return addresses were often from cities where we had no family, no friends, no apparent connections. Most disturbing of all, I began to recognize the signs of his professional attention. The way he would ask me casual questions about my day that weren't really casual at all. The way he would suggest I avoid certain people or certain activities for my own good. The way he would sometimes watch me when he thought I wasn't looking. His face wearing the same expression I had seen him use when studying his official reports. But I also began to see the moments when Klaus seemed to struggle with his dual existence. One evening in early December, our neighbour, Frau Weber, came to our door in tears. Her son had been arrested for possessing Western books, and she was desperate for help, for advice, for any kind of hope. Klaus listened to her story with apparent sympathy, even invited her in for tea. He spoke soothingly about how these matters often resolved themselves, how young people sometimes made foolish mistakes that could be forgiven. But after she left, I saw him make notes in a small book he kept locked in his desk drawer. "That poor woman," I said carefully, testing his response. Klaus looked up from his notes. "Yes, it's unfortunate." But young Weber knew the risks he was taking. "Do you think they'll be harsh with him?" "That depends on his attitude, his willingness to cooperate." Klaus closed the notebook and locked it away. "These things have a way of working themselves out." I nodded and said nothing more, but I had seen something in his face during that conversation, a flicker of genuine distress, quickly suppressed. Whatever Klaus had become, it hadn't been an easy transformation. Christmas was approaching, and with it came the delicate negotiations required for any celebration in East Germany. We had traditions to maintain, but they had to be the right kind of traditions. Religious references were discouraged, but family gatherings were approved. Gift-giving was acceptable, but the gifts had to reflect proper socialist values. Klaus brought home a small Christmas tree from somewhere. I didn't ask where he had found it, as such things were often in short supply. The children decorated it with ornaments we had collected over the years. Simple things, made of paper and glass that caught the light from our electric candles. "It's beautiful, Papa," Greta said, standing back to admire their work. Klaus smiled, and for a moment he looked like the man I had married, proud of his family, pleased by simple domestic happiness. Then Hans asked an innocent question that changed everything. "Papa, why don't we have a star on top like the Müller family?" Klaus's expression shifted subtly. "What kind of star do the Müllers have, Hans?" "A gold one. Frau Müller says it represents hope and guidance." "I see." Klaus made a mental note. I could see him filing this information away. "We prefer our tree the way it is. It's more authentic." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Klaus made one of his quiet phone calls. I heard him mention the Müllers, heard him describe their Christmas decorations and the religious implications of their star. Heinrich Müller, the lonely widower who had complained about bread rationing, was accumulating an increasingly dangerous file. I lay in bed that night thinking about Frau Weber's tears, about the Müllers' Christmas star, about my own jazz records hidden beneath our bedroom floorboards. How many of us were carrying secrets that could destroy us? How many of our neighbours were making notes about our small rebellions, our tiny assertions of individual taste or belief? And how many of us were doing both, carrying dangerous secrets while simultaneously reporting the dangerous secrets of others? The next day at the library, I made a decision. I began to keep my own file. Not on paper, that would be too dangerous, but in my memory. I started cataloguing Klaus's patterns, his contacts, his mysterious assignments. If he was going to watch me, I was going to watch him back. If our marriage was going to be a performance, I was going to learn all the choreography. I began to notice things I had previously overlooked. The way Klaus would sometimes receive urgent phone calls that required him to leave immediately, returning hours later with no explanation beyond work business. The way certain names would make him tense, colleagues he would never discuss, superiors he would never describe. The way he would sometimes come home with small injuries, a bruised knuckle, a scratch on his cheek, that he would dismiss as clumsiness. What kind of work left a man with bruised knuckles? One evening, in mid-December, Klaus came home later than usual, and I could smell alcohol on his breath. This was unusual. Klaus rarely drank more than a single beer with dinner, but tonight he seemed different, looser somehow, as if some internal control had temporarily relaxed. "Long day?" I asked, helping him out of his coat. "Yes, very long." He sat heavily at our kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing, Anna." My heart began to race. Was this a test? Was he trying to draw me into some kind of confession? Or was this a moment of genuine vulnerability? "What do you mean, Klaus?" He looked up at me, and his eyes were full of something I had rarely seen there. Doubt. "This work we do, this watching, this documenting, sometimes I think we're losing something important, something human." I sat down across from him, moving carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You're tired, Klaus. It's been a difficult year." "Has it?" He studied my face intently. "Have you found it difficult, Anna?" The question hung between us like a trap. I thought about my file in his coat pocket, about all the careful notes he had made about my subversive tendencies. I thought about the choice I faced. I could pretend to be the woman he had been documenting, or I could reveal that I knew exactly who he was and what he had been doing. Instead, I chose a third option. I think we all do what we must to protect our family, I said carefully, to keep the people we love safe. Klaus nodded slowly, and something passed between us. Not quite understanding, but perhaps recognition. We were both playing roles, both protecting secrets, both trying to navigate the impossible terrain of love in a surveillance state. Yes, he said finally, that's exactly what we do. As 1975 drew to a close, I found myself taking inventory of what I had learned and what I had lost. The discovery of my file had changed everything, but paradoxically, our daily life continued with almost oppressive normalcy. Klaus still kissed my cheek each morning before leaving for work. The children still brought home schoolwork and small dramas from their friends. I still organised our meals, our finances, our social obligations, with the same careful attention to detail I had always employed. But now I understood that we were all performing these roles while carrying the weight of deeper knowledge. Klaus knew I was being watched. I knew he was watching me. The children were learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of their school, where certain opinions were rewarded and others were dangerous. On New Year's Eve, we attended a small party at the apartment of Klaus's colleague, Comrade Richter, and his wife. It was the kind of gathering that was both mandatory and pleasurable, a careful balance of political correctness and genuine socializing. Frau Richter served homemade cookies and coffee that was better than what we could usually afford. The men discussed work in vague terms, while the women exchanged recipes and advice about managing households on state salaries. The conversation was pleasant, unremarkable, and completely scripted. But I found myself watching the other couples with new eyes, wondering about their private negotiations, their hidden knowledge of each other. Herr and Frau Brenner, married for 25 years, who seemed to communicate entirely through meaningful glances. Herr and Frau Hoffmann, newlyweds, who still held hands, but whose smiles seemed forced when certain topics arose. Were they all living versions of our double existence? Were their marriages also built on professional surveillance and personal love intertwined so completely that they could no longer be separated? Anna, Frau Richter said, settling beside me on their small sofa. Klaus tells me you're doing wonderful work at the library. So important, helping people access the right kind of information. I smiled and nodded. I enjoy helping people find what they need. Yes, exactly. Finding what they need, not necessarily what they think they want. She laughed as if she had made a clever joke. Sometimes people don't know what's good for them. Klaus appeared at my elbow with a glass of champagne, real champagne, not the sparkling wine we usually had for celebrations. The ladies are discussing literature, I assume. Anna was telling me about her work at the library, Frau Richter said. Such an important position, really. You must see everything that people choose to read. Yes, I said carefully. You learn a lot about people from their reading habits. Klaus's hand settled on my shoulder, a gesture that looked affectionate, but felt like a warning. Anna has always been very observant. The conversation continued, pleasant and meaningless, But I understood that information was being exchanged. Assessments were being made. Mental files were being updated. We were all watching each other, all reporting back to someone, all trying to protect ourselves and our families while participating in a system that required us to betray our neighbours. When midnight came, we toasted the new year with appropriate enthusiasm. Klaus kissed me as the bells chimed, and his lips tasted like champagne and secrets. Around us, other couples embraced, children laughed, and someone turned up the radio so we could hear the official New Year's broadcast from the capital. "To 1976, Klaus whispered against my ear. "May it bring us all what we deserve." I held his gaze for a long moment, trying to decode his meaning. Was that a threat? A promise? A prayer? "Yes," I said. "What we deserve." Walking home through the snowy streets, Klaus and I flanked our sleepy children and listened to their chatter about the party, the food, the other children they had played with. Their voices were bright and innocent in the cold air, and I felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. Whatever Klaus and I had become to each other, whatever complicated performance our marriage had devolved into, these children were still genuinely ours. They deserved protection, deserved the chance to grow up with some measure of safety and happiness. If that meant continuing to play our assigned roles, if it meant living with secrets and surveillance and the constant weight of watching and being watched, then that's what we would do. At home, after we had tucked the children into their beds and cleaned up from our evening out, Klaus and I stood in our small kitchen facing each other across the familiar table where we had shared thousands of meals. "Anna," he said, and his voice carried a weight I had never heard there before. "There are things about my work that I cannot discuss with you, things that must remain professional." I nodded. "I understand. But I want you to know that whatever I do, whatever is required of me, it's always in service of protecting this family, protecting you and the children." "I know, Klaus." "Do you?" He studied my face intently. "Do you really understand what that means?" I thought about my file in his coat pocket, about the photographs of me going about my daily life, about his careful documentation of my subversive tendencies. I thought about Heinrich Müller and Frau Weber and all the other neighbours whose small rebellions were being catalogued and filed away. "Yes," I said, "I think I do." Klaus reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were warm, familiar, the same hands that had held me during our courtship, that had cradled our newborn children, that had written reports about my political reliability. "Then you understand that we must be very careful, you and I. We must be very careful about what we say, what we do, who we trust, even with each other, especially with each other." I squeezed his hand, and in that gesture I felt us both acknowledging the impossible situation we found ourselves in. We loved each other. I still believed that, despite everything. But we also existed within a system that made love itself a political act, that turned intimacy into surveillance, that required us to protect our family by potentially betraying each other. "I understand," I said, and I meant it. Spring came early to East Berlin in 1976, and with it came the annual ritual of spring cleaning. It was a tradition that predated socialism, but it had been given new meaning in our republic. Out with the old, in with the new. A fresh start aligned with proper, revolutionary values. I approached this year's cleaning with particular purpose. If Klaus and I were going to continue living our double existence, if we were going to protect our family while navigating the treacherous waters of surveillance and counter-surveillance, then our household needed to be beyond reproach. The jazz records went first. My father's collection, the music that had sustained me through lonely afternoons and difficult evenings, had to be sacrificed. I removed them from their hiding place beneath our bedroom floorboards and fed them, one by one, into our small stove. The shellac made the fire burn strangely, with unusual colours and acrid smoke, but I watched each record melt and curl until nothing remained but ash. Klaus found me there, tending the fire, and though he said nothing, I saw him note the smell, the unusual smoke patterns. He understood what I was doing, and his slight nod indicated approval. Next, I went through my books, removing anything that could be considered questionable. A collection of fairy tales that included stories from capitalist countries. A cookbook that mentioned recipes from France and Italy. Even a volume of poetry that, while not explicitly political, emphasized individual emotion over collective responsibility. The children watched this process with the careful attention they had learned to apply to anything that seemed politically significant. "Why are you throwing away your books, Mama?" Hans asked. "Spring cleaning, Liebling. Sometimes we accumulate things we don't really need." Greta, always more perceptive, studied my face carefully. "Are they bad books, Mama?" "Not bad, exactly. Just not appropriate for our family right now." Klaus appeared in the doorway, observing our domestic scene. "It's good to regularly evaluate what we allow into our home," he said. "Books shape thinking, and thinking shapes behaviour." I continued my work, aware that this too was being noted, filed away, added to some mental assessment of my political evolution. But I also knew that these gestures were necessary, not just for Klaus's reports, but for our survival as a family. That evening, after the children were in bed, Klaus brought out a bottle of wine. Good wine. The kind that suggested celebration or important conversation. "I have news," he said, filling 2 glasses with unusual ceremony. "I've been offered a promotion. A new position that comes with better housing, better schools for the children." I felt my chest tighten. "What kind of position?" "I would be working more closely with foreign assets, cultural exchanges, visiting scholars, that sort of thing." He handed me a glass of wine. "It's an important role, one that demonstrates significant trust from the ministry." I understood. Klaus was being promoted within the Stasi hierarchy, moved to a position that would require even greater secrecy, even more careful compartmentalization of his professional and personal lives. "That's wonderful, Klaus. You've worked so hard for this opportunity." "Yes, but it will mean changes for all of us. The new apartment will be in a different district, one with a more select community. The children will attend different schools, schools with higher standards and more rigorous curricula." "More surveillance," he meant. "Better monitoring of our family, more comprehensive integration into the system that was both protecting and consuming us." "When would this happen?" "This summer. We would move in July, start the new school year fresh." I nodded, sipping the wine and tasting its complexity. Notes of fruit and earth, and something slightly bitter that lingered on the tongue. Like our marriage, Like our entire existence, it was beautiful and troubling at the same time. "I think it's wonderful," I said, and part of me meant it. The promotion meant security, meant Klaus's value to the system was recognised, meant our family would be protected by his increasing importance. But it also meant deeper integration into a world of secrets and surveillance, meant less chance of ever finding our way back to the simple existence we had once shared. That night, lying in bed beside my husband, the Stasi officer, I thought about the woman I had been before I found my file in his coat pocket. She seemed impossibly naive now, that woman who had worried about ordinary things, like grocery prices and the children's grades, and whether Klaus still found her attractive after 15 years of marriage. Now I understood that we were all living multiple lives simultaneously. The official version that appeared in our files, the public version we performed for our neighbours and colleagues, and the private version we maintained in the secret spaces of our hearts. The trick was learning to navigate between these versions without losing track of which one was real, or if any of them were real at all. Klaus stirred beside me, murmuring something in his sleep. In the dim light from the street lamps, his face looked peaceful, almost innocent. This was the man who had cried when our children were born, who had held me through my mother's funeral, who still brought me small gifts when he travelled for work. This was also the man who had documented my subversive tendencies and photographed me without my knowledge. Both versions were true. Both versions were Klaus, and I was learning to love them both, while protecting myself from them both. Outside our window, East Berlin slept under its blanket of surveillance and security. In apartments throughout the city, other couples were lying in similar beds, carrying similar secrets, performing similar balancing acts between love and survival. In July, we would move to our new apartment, start our new life, play our refined versions of the roles we had been developing all year. The children would adapt, as children always do. Klaus would excel in his new position, as he excelled in everything that mattered to the state. And I would continue to be Anna Fischer, librarian and mother and wife, watching and being watched, loving and being careful, surviving in the only way that seemed possible in the world we had inherited. I closed my eyes and let the familiar rhythm of Klaus's breathing lull me toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new performances, new delicate negotiations between truth and safety. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of our shared bed, I could rest in the knowledge that we had all learned our parts well enough to keep each other safe. At least for now.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.